To understand why Africa looks like it does today, you have to start way back in Earth's history, 310 million years ago to be precise. 310 million years ago, during the late Carboniferous era, the world looked nothing like today. There were no continents like today, but rather one enormous supercontinent called Pangaea. Pangaea had an area of around 125 million square kilometres, and Africa would have been right at the centre. Because Africa was at the centre of Pangaea, it only had 1/3 of its current coastline, the rest being blocked off by the surrounding land. There was one massive rainforest 25 times bigger than the Amazon that covered the whole of Pangaea. The climate was warm, humid, and oxygen levels were 168% higher than they are today. There was one super ocean called Panthalassa that surrounded Pangaea, and sea levels were around 80 metres higher than they are today, meaning large parts of Africa were underwater. However, around 305 million years ago, the extensive rainforests of Carboniferous were destroyed by climate change, leaving behind vast areas of desert. The desertification of the rainforest left Africa in an arid state covered in sand and rock, much like some places in Africa today, such as the Sahara. The desertification also led to the extinction of many species throughout Africa, leaving only reptiles and a few plants. Over time, the dead vegetation compacted and formed nearly all the coal we mine today. Around 200 million years ago, 105 million years later, the sea level had dropped by hundreds of metres, re-exposing the lowlands of Africa. Pangaea also started to fragment and split apart. This was caused by the movement of tectonic plates. Pangaea split up into several pieces, some of which resembled the continents you see today, although Europe and Asia were conjoined in a continent called Eurasia. These pieces of land gradually moved across the Earth's surface at speeds varying from 2 centimetres a year for North America all the way to 15 centimetres a year for India, the fastest a tectonic plate has ever moved. In the Jurassic period, 135 million years ago, the climate started to warm up. Because of the rise in temperature, more water evaporated and the climate began to get more humid. Because of this humidity, vegetation began to grow and the rainforest gradually returned to Africa. Because there was lots of vegetation for the animals to eat, the dinosaur population rapidly expanded and Africa quickly became the most populated place on Earth, with thousands of species of dinosaurs roaming the lands of Africa. 75 million years ago, the first primates evolved in Africa. However, approximately 65.5 million years ago, it was thought that an enormous asteroid, 10 kilometers in diameter, struck the coast of Mexico, with an equivalent force to 100 million tons of TNT exploding. This collision between Earth and asteroid threw up millions of tons of debris into the atmosphere. Large parts of debris, such as stones, fell back to Earth with relatively little effect. However, the vast quantities of dust thrown up by the impact stayed in the atmosphere and surrounded the entire Earth. This blocked out the sun, and because plants rely on the sun to get energy, photosynthesis, nearly all the vegetation died. Because there was no vegetation/food for the herbivores to eat, most of them died out, and because there was no meat for the carnivores to eat, they too died out. However, a few small mammals managed to survive this ordeal by hibernating, something dinosaurs couldn't do, and when the mammals emerged from their burrows, all the main predators had been wiped out, leaving mammals to take over the world. Also in the Paleogene era, the continents continued to drift closer to their current position. India was in the process of colliding with Asia, subsequently forming the Himalayas. The Atlantic Ocean continued to widen by a few centimetres each year. Africa was moving north to meet with Europe and form the Mediterranean Sea, and Australia had separated from Antarctica and was drifting towards Southeast Asia. Around 55 million years ago took place one of the most rapid and extreme global warming events ever recorded in geological history. In just 200,000 years, the global temperature rose by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. This event, called Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM, led to this rapid increase in both atmospheric and ocean temperature. Temperatures in the Arctic may have been as warm as 24 degrees C, and because of the temperature increase, all the existing ice on Earth melted. As the temperature rose, the already arid and dry Africa began to get even warmer. As a result of this, many mammals that lived in Africa began to migrate to colder places of the world. Even though many animals migrated, around 50% of all the animals on Earth died. The mass extinction 65.5 million years ago, coupled with this event, meant that life on Earth was in serious danger of disappearing, with only 4% of the animals that were on Earth in the Jurassic period. PETM is thought to have been caused by an increase in CO2 and/or methane in the Earth's atmosphere, but it is unknown what caused the sudden rise in CO2 and/or methane. Some argue the same thing is happening today, and global warming is just a natural thing. 33 million years ago, the climate cooled after PETM. This meant it was cold enough on the poles of the Earth for ice to form. During the next 20 to 50,000 years, about 90% of the world's fresh water froze. 90% of this water froze over Antarctica, covering 14 million square kilometers and containing 30 quadrillion cubic meters, or 30 million cubic kilometers of ice. This ice has stayed frozen for the past 33 million years and is still frozen to this day. Because all this water froze, the global sea level dropped by about 60 meters. 28 million years ago, the first apes evolved from primates in Africa. As the continent of Africa continued to drift into Europe, around 5.6 million years ago, the gap between present-day Morocco and Spain, known as the Strait of Gibraltar, closed up, preventing the flow of water between the Mediterranean Sea and the North Atlantic. The Mediterranean Sea was isolated, and because it was isolated, when water evaporated, it was not replenished. The Mediterranean Sea is salt water, so when water evaporates, the salt didn't. This meant the more water that evaporated, the higher the level of salt. As the salt level increased, marine life forms couldn't stand the environment and died. Eventually, all the life that once lived in the Mediterranean Sea died. Eventually, all the water evaporated, leaving a deep basin, 3 to 5 kilometers below the sea level in some places. Because the water evaporated and precipitated elsewhere around the world, the global sea level rose by around 10 meters. The basin was lined with a thick layer of salt, which today is mined as a valuable resource in many African countries because salt preserves food. The sea was completely decimated and no life could survive in the hostile conditions. Some rivers diverged into the basin to provide some fresh water in areas of the basin, but overall it was a vast and lifeless place. Until 5.3 million years ago, a piece of land on the border between Africa and Europe, which held back the Atlantic, broke away under the immense pressure, and the North Atlantic then flooded the basin, forming the present-day Mediterranean Sea. This event was called the Zanclean Flood. As a consequence, the sea level dropped by 10 meters to roughly where it is today. After this event, the position of Africa in relation to Europe hasn't changed much, although Africa is still moving towards Europe. Could this lead to a repeat in the future? 3 million years ago in Africa, the first bipedal apes evolved. Bipedal meaning walking on 2 legs rather than 4. 2.5 million years ago, the first animals in the Homo line of species evolved in Africa and were called Homo habilis. 1.8 million years ago, Homo habilis evolved into the first species to use tools and control fire, called Homo erectus. And finally, only 200,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens, or anatomically modern humans, evolved in Africa, marking the beginning of human history and a whole new type of geography, that of which humans have greatly influenced. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on the pre-human geographical history of Africa. Baba yetu yetu liye mbinguni yetu yetu amina.